Movements by nature are social and cultural phenomena. They tend to arise when a group of people unite around a particular cause. And of course, as we enter into the middle of the 2020s, we're seeing a number of these social and cultural causes emerge in our society today. You think of Black Lives Matter, for example, or Blue Lives Matter, or All People Matter, a number of social causes that coming out of cultural issues that people continue to wrestle with. And so a movement typically has a life cycle, and we'll get more into that life cycle in our next segment. But for now, just very briefly, a movement will eventually coalesce around a cause, that people will become united around that passion for seeing some kind of social change or cultural change in a particular place. Eventually, that cause, as people begin to coalesce around it and unite around it, it will develop a bureaucracy. Begin to implement strategies for achieving their goals. Oftentimes, these causes will provide training programs for volunteers so that they are, in some way, socialized to the cause, if not, in fact, indoctrinated to the cause. And eventually, we'll see that movements will decline. Both in a negative sense, as they might just become irrelevant, but in a positive sense, as they might actually become a part of the mainstream of a society. The professor of sociology, Rebecca Vonderhaar, discusses 4 types of movements. She enumerates these as alternative movements, redemptive movements, reformative social movements, as well as revolutionary movements. In terms of alternative movements, these are movements that are typically focused on self-improvement, and they're generally limited to specific changes to individuals' behavior or beliefs. These might include things like Alcoholics Anonymous, that are trying to change the behaviors of people who have a particular addiction to alcohol. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, trying to change the behaviors of those who might drive while intoxicated, or come alongside of those who have been victims of drunk drivers. Planned Parenthood also might be thought of in terms of an alternative movement. Second are redemptive movements, and these are sometimes called religious movements, or we would talk about them today, at least in the academic arena, as new religious movements. And these are typically movements that are meaning-seeking. They are trying to focus on a specific segment of the population, and their goal is to provoke some type of inner change and spiritual growth in individuals. And we can think of a number of these in our society today. Scientology, for example, or the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, are all redemptive movements within our society that are seeking some type of spiritual transformation among people. The New Age movement, which was popular in the 80s and the 90s and still hangs on a bit today in our culture through different activities of astrology and palm reading and tarot cards. Other new religious movements might include some of the rise of neo-paganism, what I've talked about in terms of the ancientization of these old beliefs that are reviving in our society today. On a global level, we see this not only in the United States and Western Europe, Great Britain, but we see this also in places like Egypt and other areas. Third, reformative social movements are those movements that seek change to something specific about a social structure. They may seek a more limited change, but are targeted at the entire population. Environmental movements you might think of in terms of these reformative social movements. The women's suffrage movement, for example, would be a reformative social movement that focused on a particular segment of the population, being women, but something that would have a social impact, and that is the right for women to vote. Or we think of more contemporary movements, as I mentioned earlier, like Black Lives Matter would be an example of that. Sometimes these are protest movements that are trying to incite a social change as they recognize the social injustice, for example. And so these are thought of in terms of reformative social movements. And then fourth, finally, the revolutionary movements. These are movements that seek to completely change every aspect of society. Their goal is to change all of society in a dramatic way. And we think here of the civil rights movement. We might, at some level, think as well as the not just the hashtag Black Lives Matter, but the organization Black Lives Matter that has an agenda that is far greater than just simply based on race, but also focusing on the gender identity and equality and those types of things. And so they take on more of a revolutionary type of movement. They'll typically be politically oriented and seek to have legislation to changed that would favor the focus, the cause of that particular movement. Well, these are interesting movements, interesting descriptions of various types of movements, and so we might want to think in terms of the movement that we see in the New Testament, the Christian movement. And how does Christianity line up and fit, perhaps, in some of these categories? We might rightly talk about Christianity as an alternative movement. It certainly was offering something different than what society held as norm, being in the context of Judaism in the Roman world, but also in Roman and Greek pagan religions. So Christianity did offer something that was focusing on behavioral changes as well as changes of beliefs, as we see in alternative movements. Christianity is certainly a redemptive movement, as it is seeking to see specific segments of the population to gain a deeper understanding and seek meaning in their lives, both in a spiritual way as well as in an inner way. We could rightly talk about Christianity as a reformative movement. It certainly is seeking some changes in society. We think of the efforts of the early church to engage in various social injustices, like the exploitation of women. We see this social reformative type of movement in terms of the care that the church had for widows and orphans. And so Christianity might rightly be looked at in terms of it being a reformative movement. And we might even consider Christianity being a revolutionary movement. Not certainly in a violent way, but definitely in a way that it had an impact on society. Christianity's goal was to see transformation, not just of the individual, but transformation of the entire society. And that it certainly did see. Well, as we get more into the anatomy of a movement, we'll focus specifically on some of the characteristics of that Christian movement in the first century and look at what we might call the marks of a movement as being helpful for us as we think about what a movement might look like in our world, wherever that might be today.